Laurie, welcome to my video.
I'm so excited.
I remember when, I had my head in the clouds and I first wrote the first edition, I don't know, like 11 years ago of the Human Magnet Syndrome. And of course, somehow I came across you.
Yeah.
And we have been connected in a really nice way for the last 10 years.
And I have to say, yes, on my radio show, and I had you on multiple times. And since then, your book, has been a staple in my library and as a referral, because I see so many people who find themselves in these codependent narcissist relationships that it has been the Bible for these people. And it has been a game changer. I'm telling you this in all honesty, and this isn't no ass kissing happening here. This is truly what I believe. Okay.
Yeah.
And groundbreaking. And when my clients read it, they're like, oh my God, that's me.
Right.
I can't believe that's me. And so it's quite validating for a lot of people.
Well, thank you. So Laurie sends me this email and she said, of course, something about sex and how it impacts relationships. And it wasn't until that email I ever thought about addressing sexual matters on a public forum.
That has not been I spent my last 30 plus years of my career talking exclusively about sexuality in every forum that I possibly could, and all for educating the public and such. So I'm really happy that we can talk about this in, sexuality within relationships and within problematic relationships.
Thank you. But before we begin, can you tell my listeners and viewers, who are you? And what do you do?
So I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a specialty in sexual wellness. Have been working for, like I said, over 30 years. I've been in the media a lot. So in my local Montreal, Canada, I did a nightly radio program, of which you were a guest, for 22 years. So, I did over 5,000 episodes talking about sexuality. I wrote a book called The Sex Bible for people over 50. I do a podcast now called Passion with Dr. Laurie. I've done television shows. I am the director for the Pornhub Sexual Wellness Center, which is a sex education site off of Pornhub. So directing people to real sexual, information rather than getting their information through pornography only. Right. So kind of so that was the latest project that I hopped on.
Maybe I should have asked you what you don't do. Wow.
Yeah.
You're amazing.
I'm a busy gal, and I have a clinical practice, of course, a full clinical practice. So, yeah.
But what amazes me is you got a heart. People are talking to a real person, not an academic who position themselves because of their marketing team to be the shocking sex guru. And no, you. Yeah,
that's not me. No.
No. And so
I never aspired to be anybody than just me, and if good stuff happens, great. But there's no marketing team behind me. No.
So one of the things we started off in our introduction, and you and I have been emailing about, is the connection of my Human Magnet Syndrome work, contributions, and the discussion of sexuality. And I was curious because we've never really primarily focused on this. And I think this might be our fourth, whether podcast or interview.
Together, yeah.
So you're my guest, which is still, I'm getting used to. I'm used to being on the other side. So
that's true.
And, my wife said, put a stickum or a Post-it note. Listen and don't talk.
To remember, right?
But my work. I am fairly familiar with your work, but where do you want to start this conversation? What do you think would be of the greatest interest to our listeners and viewers?
So when people come to me, specifically to me, they usually come to me because they have a sexual issue. Okay. And they end up in my office. The thing is, 90% of the time, it's a symptom of something else. And the first thing I look at is the relationship, right? What's going on in this couple's life?
Right.
Sometimes I'll just get a woman coming in saying, I have a problem with desire, and my husband thinks there's something seriously wrong with me, and he thinks I'm this and he thinks I'm that, and he's, telling me I should go get help. And then, in talking and exploring her and her connection to the partner and her relationships, it's not that difficult to see quickly that this person might be in a codependent relationship, or that her partner might be a narcissist, right? And so, of course, that's going to have an impact on one's desire for sex. It's going to have an impact on how the partner may feel pressured to have sex. How, and let's just say in this case where, she's having, like, her husband has great desire, like puts a lot of demands on to have a lot of sex in terms of quantity. She feels quite pressured, does it anyway, doesn't get anything out of it,
right?
But he doesn't, oftentimes he doesn't care all that much, or she tells me that he, it's not really about that, but she also doesn't want to rock the boat, right? So,
sounds codependent.
She wants to know, like, what's wrong with me that I don't desire my husband. And it's sometimes very hard when then I look at her and say, well, you feel abused, you feel criticized, you fight, over this, that, and the other. You feel pressured. You don't feel heard. You don't feel appreciated. You don't feel validated. How are you supposed to muster up these warm feelings,
right,
so that you can open up to be sexual with your partner?
Right.
So, and that this is in general when we have dysfunctional kind of relationships or toxic relationships. So, it's not specific to the codependent narcissist cycle, but it is true of most unhealthy relationships, let's say.
So you know this, but I want to remind any new viewers or new listeners that I created the term self-love deficit disorder to replace the term codependency, because codependency is just stigmatizing, and it was just time to get rid of something that made people feel bad. So I refer to that as SLDD, and I refer to the codependent as self-love deficient and SLDs. So just those are the terms I'll use. But by the way, I suck at telling jokes. It's like I have performance anxiety whenever I think of a joke. It's like I really want to do it, and then I freeze. So there's two codependents and they're having sex. And after sex, and one codependent leans over to the other and says, I did it again.
You're losing it now, right? You don't want to.
Oh, yeah, I go, okay, sex was great, but how was it for me? And I probably said it wrong, but what that joke communicates is sex for SLDs or codependents often is geared for the other person.
Other person, right.
And there's all sorts of reasons for that we can talk about later about codependent narcissist human magnet syndrome. But what I want to talk about is how a person who is forced to have uncomfortable, unsatisfying sex that lacks mutuality, lacks tenderness. I mean, if your lover has a personality disorder, is a pathological narcissist, they naturally don't have that. Then they have two choices, and I'm being general, and that is to dissociate in some manner. Because I look at dissociation on a continuum. The worst case is what we call these serious dissociative disorders. I'm not talking about that. But it's to somehow remove themselves emotionally, affectively from the act, because they don't have the power to say no. They're afraid to say no because of their own codependent inner dialogue, or they're afraid of saying no because of the consequences.
What you're saying is very true. The problem is over time, right? That it like builds, and what happens over time? How does a person feel? So I knew this one woman, she said to me, unless I was stoned out of my head, I couldn't have sex with my partner. Like, there's no way, and then I would have to go somewhere else. Like, I'd have to think about something else. There was no connection with the partner, but she knew that if she didn't have sex with him every third day, he was cranky and horrible, and
like
he would say mean things. And he's like, "Look, I did the dishes. You wouldn't just give me a blowjob." Like, it was just not nasty things. So like for her, it was like, if I wasn't, wasted, I couldn't do it. So that's one way of dissociating. But for women who let's say, don't numb themselves with agents or anything like that, over time, they start to describe it like feeling assaulted. And even the slightest touch starts to feel like an assault. So it's not just like the act of sex, but any movement to, that initiates like a partner grabs your butt while you're doing the dishes can feel like an assault. So because ultimately, if you think about what consent is, right? Consent is not submission. Consent is should be given enthusiastically.
Right.
So, and there's a distinction between submission, which is not consent. If I submit to your pressure and I say yes out of pressure, that's not consent. So those individuals are often in those, they find themselves in that position where, yes, they'll submit for the sake of, to keep the peace, but what happens over time, they feel like they are having non-consensual sex.
And let me,
essentially.
Let me add to that. A lot of my clients describe that same type of scenario. And then there are the pathological narcissists who might be sex addicted, who might have some type of paraphilia. And I differentiate sex addiction and paraphilia from just the wide range of whatever feels good between two people is good. I have a very
of
wide.
Course, anything they do is fine between two people.
But when the narcissist has a sexual preference, desire, practice that goes against the SLD, the codependent's comfort level, they submit, and they also, out of fear or out of a learned response that goes all the way back to their childhood, give this consent that if you or I would watch this, which would be kind of creepy, but just for clinical purpose, would watch this happen, someone would say, hey, let's do this. Let's do a threesome. And the SLD codependent partner would say, oh, okay, sure. But you're looking at her or her and you're saying, she's going, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. And so the consent part is even more murky than we think, because SLDs not only are terrified of not obliging the person or giving consent, but there are real punishments. And adding a little, one more step to that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is then their whole life, going back to their childhood, if they did not consent to picking up the toothbrush, washing the laundry, driving the kids, or whatever, there was always a punishment. And so the concept of consent often is very blurry to my SLD or codependent clients.
Sure, because we do learn about consent as kids, right? Like, may I please play with your toy? Or, teaching that, you have to say yes, and you teach consent with friendships and not just sexual consent. Then you kind of grow on that when it comes to consent. But I've seen some very, very sad cases over the years, some horrific behaviors actually on the part of narcissists that made their partners do stuff that I can't even, I remember one client whose partner sold her to friends, and, would make her have, have sex with strangers and then film it. And, in his mind, well, you agreed to you liked it, well, she was pretending. So, I mean, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that happens too, right? It's like, I'm saying yes to doing this. So now I have to kind of, explain it to myself that maybe I liked it. So maybe it was okay. So, because otherwise it would just feel like rape time and time again.
And I'm glad you said that. Let's talk about rape, because there is not a lot of ambiguity of what is and what is not rape. And please, of course, correct me. Rape is forced sex against someone's will that feels aggressive. Am I simplifying it too much?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about sexual assault is a more general term.
Yeah.
Let's say when we think of rape, we think of intercourse, but there's so many other forms of sexual assault, right? But the problem is what is forced? Because if we look at the definition of consent and we look at submission as not being consensual, is it forced? The person who's doing the forcing would say, no, it's not. You said yes. You uttered the words yes.
This is exactly why I brought it up.
Right.
Because for me, it's not a gray area. But for, I think, a lot of people, it's a gray area. So if a SLD, say a codependent woman, could be man, has an aggressive, uncompromising, unempathetic, and pushy partner who wants to have sex that is humiliating or painful, and that person says no and tried to say no early on in the relationship, what we know about codependents, SLDs, is that they learned through either gaslighting or just basic conditioning that it's better to say yes because there's less punishments. At least they imagine that, whether it's true or not, than the consequence of this sexual aggression. And so to my clients, it is important for me to actually tell them so they can hear it, that when I say, that sounds like rape. And then they'll say, really? And then I start identifying, you don't like it because it hurts. You fought back before and he didn't stop. And there was a point when you fought back, maybe the last time you fought back, you realized that the consequence of any more fighting would cause as much pain than the act itself, whether true or not. Well, doesn't that sound like rape? And whether it qualifies for the clinical definition, it changes changes the perception that this is just not submitting to a consensual act, because the consensual nature was taken away when any form of prior resistance was shut down in consequence.
Yeah, dismissed. Exactly. And I'm going to give you another example of a recent case, which to me was absolutely horrific. And it was clear to me that I was dealing with an SLD and a narcissistic partner. But they came into therapy because to his insistence, he wanted more sex and what have you. So I discover through the initial assessment that she had an abortion not long ago, and she had said to me, and she was talking about it in a very it was interesting to hear the tone, but she was saying, I never wanted children. When we met, I told him I never wanted children. He agreed that we would never have children. So we agreed that he would use condoms, and that was the agreement. Okay. And so she finds herself pregnant. Okay. And he nonchalantly says, well, I decided I wanted a kid. So I took the condom off, and she didn't know that I took the condom off. Got her pregnant, and she didn't want, so she went ahead, her body, her choice. She decided to end the pregnancy. And I was like, I was like speechless, right? It was like, and I uttered the words, that was an assault. That was a form of assault, right? We call it stealthing. Of course, he freaked out on me and never came back, but
And what I teach my clients or anyone who wants to listen to me, that to measure the trauma, people have a good measuring stick for abuse. He punched me. He punched me hard. He punched me 10 times. He pushed me. But trauma that has no physical evidence, and it could be neglect, abandonment, passive aggressive treatment, something that has no physical evidence. Now, in this case, there's physical evidence. Yeah,
she got pregnant. Right.
But what I want to say is trauma is determined not by what happened, but by the experience of it. And that trauma, in my estimation, of course, I can't imagine this because, I'm a man and I could try to at least empathize with it. But especially for someone who either wasn't ready or had decided to not have a child or just didn't want to have a child with this person.
Categorically. It was very clear. She had made it clear.
Unbelievably traumatic.
Right. But he decided that he wanted it.
Yeah.
So it was going to be his way,
Yeah. And so our SLD clients, because you might work with narcissists that I don't think they like me very much. And
who, narcissists?
Yeah.
They're not. They don't like me either. And believe me, they don't like me. They don't come back too often.
Yeah.
And, most narcissists don't really go into therapy anyway.
Yeah.
So
you're right. But there's another form of this. It's not invisible, but I'm going to call it amorphous. This type of trauma that is so real to the person, but yet it can't be seen, identified, or quantified, or it can, but the people listening to it can't affirm it.
We're going to do this again because it's obviously there's so much to say. And I'm getting you on my podcast because it's something I want to talk about is people who like how to live with a narcissist if you choose not to leave, right? Like how best to handle it.
Yeah.
Because some people aren't ready to leave for whatever reason. So I got
a lot to say
talk to you about that. I know you do. I got a lot to say about sex. So we could go on all night if we want to.
But can you let our listeners know about you and how to find you and connect with you and all that good stuff?
Sure. So if people want to find me on social media, they can just go to Instagram, which is Passion with Dr. Laurie. So you'll have news about my podcast and such, and you can, the Passion with Dr. Laurie is available on all podcast platforms. If people want to get in touch with me via email, they just have to go to my website, which is drlaurie.com. That's DRLAURIE.com. That's it.
And for me, selfloverecovery.com. And everything I talk about, I might talk a lot about, this or that, but it's really about helping people overcome codependency, and that's to achieve self-love. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.